The book is called The Uncrowned King, The Sensational Rise of William Randolph Hearst. And it started out in my mind simply as a story about a newspaper war. I was interested in newspaper competition. I'd been in a bit of one in Canada between two national newspapers, and I got interested in the lost arts of newspaper competition, because newspapers don't really compete anymore. Most of them are in monopolies. And so I started reading back into newspaper history, and you can't read far into the history of newspaper competition without coming to this enormous war between Hearst and Pulitzer in the 1890s in New York City. Hearst comes to New York as a young man, a virtual unknown, aged about 31, and takes on Pulitzer, who at the time is the king of the heap in American publishing, a towering figure. Quite literally, he had at the time the biggest building in New York City, the World Building, 16 stories, the tallest commercial structure in the world, and it was an emblem of his success as a publisher. He was a formidable figure and a great newspaper man, and this young upstart, Hearst, comes into town and starts a competition with them, and they go head to head for 3 years during one of the most interesting, exciting periods in the history of the city and the nation. It takes us through the 1896 presidential election, which was William Jennings Bryan, Cross of Gold, against William McKinley, generally considered the most exciting campaign in American history, and certainly the first modern campaign with the whistle-stop tours and as charismatic a figure, Bryan, as we've perhaps seen until Obama. Hearst played a very crucial role in that election as the only publisher in the whole of the Northeast who was supporting Bryan. Right after that, they find themselves in another sort of war over Cuba, the Spanish-American War, which is generally considered one of the low points in the history of American journalism, and Hearst is often blamed for what transpired. I personally think it was one of the greatest things any newspaper's ever done. Hearst advocating U.S. intervention against Spain over Cuba. We can perhaps talk about that some more later. But that was America's entry to the world stage, and a crucial event in the life of the country, and a really exciting episode in the newspaper war in New York at the time. By the end of about 3 years, Hearst had emerged not only as the largest circulating publisher in the city, but the voice of the Democratic Party in the U.S. and the voice of the left, really, in the U.S. at the time. And he went on to found what was the greatest publishing empire in America. It was comprised by the 20s of, I think, 28 daily newspapers and a whole bunch of magazines, and soon after a radio network, in addition to his motion picture empire. And of course, Hearst owned whole blocks of Manhattan real estate as well, and it all started really for him with his success in New York City. That made the empire he built possible. So that's generally what the book's about, and I'll leave it to Alan to guide us through the rest of the conversation.
There are a number of biographies of Hearst. What was it that convinced you that there was more to say?
Well, it was the way other biographers treated his journalism, really, that got me going on it. The general take on Hearst is that he was a failure in his chosen profession, that he was a failure as a journalist, and that he succeeded as a newspaperman to the extent that he succeeded by taking the low road, by appealing to the lowest common denominator through cheap sensationalism, a lot of sex scandals and dirty laundry and cheap gossip, and that he titillated the masses with this kind of content and sort of cynically built a big audience in this manner. He's never given credit for any meritorious journalism and for having a serious sense of purpose. And I initially didn't quarrel with that view of Hearst. I was going to write about the newspaper war, but he became the central focus of the story when I began looking at his newspaper and looking at the quality of the journalism. And you can't see it without you know, on every page, it's evident that this is a guy who had a very strong sense of public purpose, that he really was deeply concerned for the welfare of the common man and for the average citizen of New York. He was crusading on their behalf day after day after day, fighting what he called the malefactors of consolidated capital and against all sort of corruption in government. And so he, I think, had a very strong will and a strong voice and determination to do good with the newspaper, and that hadn't come out at all in any of the biographies, and I thought needed to be corrected.
And why do you think it hadn't?
Well, there's a few reasons. One is that when you do a biography of Hearst, he lived a long life. He lived 80 years, and he did a lot of things in his life. As I mentioned, he was in movies, he was in radio, he was in publishing. He had a very interesting personal life, and so if you're going to write about all of those things, you tend not to go too deep in one area. And so a lot of the biographers, when it came to write about his journalism, looked at some of the memoirs of people who had been around at the time he came to New York, and looked at what a lot of his critics and his rivals had said about him, because they left the most voluminous records. And a lot of it's unflattering, and there's a lot of competitive bitterness in it, and it's taken at face value. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think he got a fair shake. Also, over time, he changed, and his journalism changed, and it wasn't as good over time in the 20s and 30s and 40s, I don't think, as it was in this early part of his career when he was a hands-on editor and operating his own newspapers. When he became too big to be closely involved in any individual title, I think the quality suffered. Also, he got active politically just after this period, and his politics began to interfere with his newspapers and his newspapers' politics. Not so much that his newspapers were always promoting his candidacy, but they were read by people as promoting his ideals and his candidacy, and I think his credibility as a newspaperman suffered a bit for his political activities. So those are some of the reasons.
So is it your sense that prior biographers, I hate to say, were too lazy to do what you have done? Did they simply not go back and compare the quality of his journalism to what his competitors were doing at the same time?
Well, I spent a lot of time looking not only at his paper, but looking at what other papers were doing. And just to give you a small example, biographers are often critical of the fact that Hearst routinely abused his political and journalistic rivals in print, in his own newspapers. He was always heaping insults on them, personal insults, and he was reporting on their failures as newspapermen. Every time they got something wrong, he'd run a story on it, and so people look at this in his newspaper and think, well, you know, that's kind of cheap and tawdry behavior, and they criticize Hearst for it, and they go and look at all the other papers, and they're all doing the same thing, and that was just the way journalists operated right now. They were sniping at one another all of the time, and they policed one another. It was actually a good thing, I think, for journalism, that they watched each other very closely and were very quick to point out one another's failings. You know, now we have single newspaper towns, and we have ombudsmen, there's, you know, and those sorts of things at newspapers who supposedly serve as watchdogs. But when you got close rivals watching each other closely, all the mistakes get turned up.
It's hard to emphasize how revolutionary Ken's book is in simply liking Hearst. I think it's the first biography in 90 years that's been sympathetic to the guy. you've suggested some of the ways that you found him admirable professionally. How about personally, what's to like about him?